kids. Let's finish our story today, okay? So let's see, where did we leave off, Zanzibar? Zanny's wanting lots of love. Are you wanting lots of love, Zanzibar? All right, so we're on chapter 9, and it's called A Rescue. Mrs. Honeybee had awakened that morning expecting a perfectly ordinary day. As was now usual with her, she thought first of her mouse. My mice, I should say, I suppose, but of course the mother is just an average mouse, she said, whereas my little mouse is the 8th wonder of the world. How beautifully he sings, and how well we communicate now. I teach, he learns, and so quickly too. What a pity it is that humans and animals can't communicate directly by speech. I could say, I'm Jane Honeybee, and he would reply, and I'm whatever it is. I really ought to give him a name. And I'd say, what kind of song would you like me to teach you today? And he might say, oh, something cheery because it's a lovely day. And then I might play, oh, what a beautiful morning from the musical Oklahoma. Mrs. Honeybee got out of bed and washed and dressed, went downstairs, made herself some breakfast, and fed the cat. Later that morning, after she had puttered around the garden for a while and was thinking about going to the living room to put out a chocolate for the morning playing, she suddenly remembered that she'd forgotten to make her bed. She went upstairs and stood at the open bedroom window for a moment, looking down the sunlit street and whistling, oh, what a beautiful morning. But then, suddenly, it wasn't. As Mrs. Honeybee turned away from the window, momentarily blinded by the glare of the sunlight, she tripped over a small footstool and fell. Because she was old and stiff, she fell awkwardly, and she hit the ground. She heard a horrible cracking sound and what felt like white-hot pain in one ankle. For a while, she lay in a state of shock, but then she began to try to get to her feet, or rather to one foot. The other, she realized, could not possibly have any weight put on it. But she was quite shaky, and her efforts were in vain. Oh, dear Jane Honeybee, she gasped as she lay on the bedroom floor. What in the world's to become of you? And then, half fainting, because the pain was so sharp, she gave a groan. Wolf, running into the bedroom at the sound, was mystified. Why was the lady lying on the floor with her eyes closed? And that groan had been a most unhappy noise. I must try and brighten her up, he thought. And in the most cheerful voice he could manage, he began to sing his version of the words to Come on, everyone, sing and dance and run, making friends and having a lot of fun. Mrs. Honeybee opened her eyes. Oh, Mouse, she said, you certainly are a good pal. You must have been wondering where I'd gone. You haven't had your morning chocolate. Oh, and I was going to teach you a new song, too. Oh, dear, if only you could understand me. I'd ask you to go downstairs and pick up the phone and dial 911. When they ask what's wrong, you could answer, Mrs. Honeybee needs an ambulance. I need help, Mouse. I need help. Wolf, of course, could not understand a word of this, but some instinct told him that the lady was in trouble. I can't do anything, he thought. She needs a human being to come to her aid. And where are the other humans? Well, they're out on the street. He ran across the room and he climbed up the curtains and onto the windowsill. Mrs. Honeybee's house was on a quiet, tree-lined street where many people were not usually about. But at that very moment, a man appeared, walking at a leisurely pace along the sidewalk toward the house. He was a tallish man, Wolf saw as he peered down, and he was dressed in a dark blue uniform and wearing a cap. His boots were big and black. No good squeaking at him, Wolf thought. I must sing as loud as I can to attract his attention. What shall I sing? Quickly, he thought about some new songs that he had learned. Mrs. Honeybee's taste in music was broad, but by chance, she had recently taught Wolf an old Beatles song. At the top of his voice, Wolf began to sing, Help! At the sound of that voice, so high, so pure, so true, the policeman stopped on his patrol and looked up at the bedroom window. Not only was he the local community policeman, but he also sang in the police choir, and what's more, he was friendly with Mrs. Honeybee, knowing her one-time reputation as a concert pianist. Sometimes, as he walked along the street, he had heard her singing as she played, but this was not her voice. This was in a far higher register. In fact, it was the voice of a coloratura? I don't know that word. Soprano. The policeman squinted upward, but he could see nothing, for Wolf was hidden from his gaze by the ivy that covered the house. He stood a moment, smiling, for the voice, whoever it belonged to, was very lovely. Must be a recording she's playing, he thought as the song ended. Here's a picture. Let's see if I can get right up there to you. Do you see? There's Mouse in the windowsill, and way down below, you can see the police officer. He was about to walk on when he thought he heard a noise coming from the bedroom, a noise that sounded almost like a groan. Huh, I hope the old lady's all right, he said to himself, and he went and he knocked on the front door, and then he rang the doorbell. No one came. He looked through the letter slot and saw letters scattered on the hall floor. Mrs. Honeybee, the policeman shouted up at the bedroom window, is everything all right? And in reply, he heard a feeble, no. Quickly, the policeman used his radio to contact his station sergeant. It's Mrs. Honeybee, he said. You know, the pianist lady. She's in trouble, I think, Sarge. Better send an ambulance. I'll try to get into the house. So it was that Wolf's singing brought help. The policeman borrowed a ladder from a neighbor and climbed up and through the open bedroom window to comfort Mrs. Honeybee, and then to let the paramedics in when they arrived. Wolf, hiding behind the curtains, watched as very carefully the paramedics lifted the lady onto a stretcher. The cat, she said as they loaded her into the ambulance. Who will feed the cat? Don't worry, Mrs. H., said the policeman. I'll go right now and ask the next door neighbors to do it. And off he went. But what about my mice? Said Mrs. Honeybee. Who will give them their chocolate candy? She's wandering in her mind a bit, said one of the paramedics. It's the pain, said his partner. Your mice will be all right, they said. To think, said Mrs. Honeybee, that I was going to teach him. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Teach who? Said the first paramedic. My little mouse. He sings beautifully, you know. Yes, love, said the second soothingly. Yes, of course he does. They think she's gone crazy. All right, so chapter 10 is called A Composer. If Mrs. Honeybee had been young, the hospital would have set her broken ankle, put it in a cast or a bandage, and sent her home in no time at all. As it was, the doctors decided to keep her for a while because of the shock she had suffered and because she didn't quite seem to be in her right mind. She kept worrying the nurses about a singing mouse to whom she was teaching songs. So Wolf and Mary were alone in the house, apart from the cat, which they now never saw, and those brothers and sisters of Wolf who had not moved out, but who never came back to the living room anyway. Mary did not particularly miss the lady, but she did miss the chocolates. She had become hooked on them, and she was now suffering severe withdrawal symptoms. These made her short-tempered, and a good deal of the time she addressed her son as Wolfgang Amadeus. Wolf missed his friends badly. What's more, he had no idea when she would return. How he longed to see her sitting at the piano, smiling at him, for he now knew that when she showed her teeth at him, it did not, as would have been the case with most animals, mean that she was angry with him, but rather the reverse. He missed his singing lessons very much, and though he practiced his scales every day, as she had taught him, and sang all the songs he'd learned, it wasn't the same without the accompanist. I'm so much trouble with that word. Nor, of course, was he hearing any new melodies. One evening, when Mrs. Honeybee had been in the hospital for 4 or 5 days, Wolf was sitting and thinking on the piano stool. It made him feel closer to his friend when suddenly an idea occurred to him. She's not here to teach me new tunes, but why don't I make up my own music? Has any mouse ever composed music before, I wonder? No, but then has any mouse ever sung the way I can? Why shouldn't I be a composer as well as a singer? Think how surprised she'll be when I sing my own music to her, my very own. And I don't mean Dumpty stuff, but really difficult music like she sometimes plays, where I can really use my voice to its best advantage. What's more, if I sing this piece of music, whatever it turns out to be, often enough to her, she can learn to play it, and then can accompany me. What a pity it is that animals and humans can't communicate directly by speech. She could say, I'm whoever it is. I really ought to give her a name, and I'd say, I'm the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mouse. Composition, Wolf found, was not at all easy. He spent many hours sitting on the piano top, warbling away without producing anything that satisfied him. He didn't bother with words. The melodies were what interested him. Then one day he hit upon a theme that he immediately knew would be the backbone of his piece. He was sitting, not on the piano, but upstairs on the sill of the now closed window in the ladies' bedroom. He looked out, and there, high up in the sky, were swallows, hawking for insects in the warm evening air. A swooping, twisting, darting melody came into his head, ready-made. As he sang the first few bars of it, Wolf felt suddenly inspired, and the music poured out of his mouth, and his voice swooped and twisted and darted like the birds. Somehow he seemed to know instinctively where the musical work of his would start, and the way it would continue, and how it would end. And when it did end, he sang it again and again until he had every note firmly fixed in his head. Then he ran downstairs to find his mother. "Mommy!" he cried. "What do you think? I'm a composer." "Composer?" said Mary Mouse crustily, for she was missing those chocolate candies. "What on earth does that mean, Wolfgang Amadeus?" "I have made up some music of my very own," said Wolf. "Shall I sing it to you?" "If you must," said Mary. Truth to tell, she had very poor musical ear, and though she was proud of her son's talents, she derived little pleasure from most of the songs he sang. But now, as she listened, she found herself at first interested, and then moved, and finally captivated by the beauty of the music that he was singing, by its lightness, its airiness, its sheer joyfulness. "Oh, Wolf, dear," she said when he had finished, "that was really lovely. Does it have a name?" "Yes," said Wolf. "That is my Swallow Sonata." So we've got one more chapter. It's called Chapter 11, and it's called A Recital. When Mrs. Honeybee did come home, she was on crutches, and a nurse was with her. The first thing Mrs. Honeybee thought about was her mouse, but she didn't say anything to the nurse. She had realized that in the hospital she had babbled on a bit about her singing mouse, and they had probably thought she was senile, which is kind of a word for crazy. But now that she was back home, she knew that she wanted the matter kept secret. If it got out that she had the world's first singing mouse beneath her roof, the publicity would be overwhelming, and she would never again have a moment's peace. The first thing she did was to go to her grand piano and, leaning one crutch against the wall and balancing with the other, tap out with one finger, "There's no place like home." "You'll have a tough time playing, dear," said the nurse, "with that foot in a cast." "I'll just have to manage with one pedal for the time being," said Mrs. Honeybee. "Well, I'll tell you one thing you won't be able to manage," said the nurse, "and that's those stairs. We'll have to make you a bed downstairs. Where shall it be? In your den?" "No, here, please," said Mrs. Honeybee. "Here in the living room, right next to my beloved piano. And very near my beloved mouse," she thought. "There's a sort of day bed," she said, "that I use out in the garden. You'll find it in the conservatory at the back of the house. I'll be with you in half a minute." And when the nurse had left the room, she hopped across to the candy tin. She opened a fresh packet of chocolates and then put not one but two on the piano stool before following the nurse. When they came back to make up the bed, the chocolates, Mrs. Honeybee saw immediately, were gone. "Look, Mommy," Wolf had said, "one each." "Oh, thank goodness," Mary had cried, and she had begun to gobble her chocolate like a crazy thing. Once she was sure that Mrs. Honeybee had everything she wanted, the nurse left, saying that she would be back the next morning. As soon as she had gone, Mrs. Honeybee put out another double ration of candy on the piano top, this time, and sat on a stool and waited. In the mouse hole, Mary said, "She's put out some more. I can smell it. Come on, Wolf." "Okay, Mommy," said Wolf, and together they came out and they ran up the leg of the piano and onto the top. "One each again," squeaked Mary, and she attacked her chocolate eagerly. Wolf did not touch his. Instead, he sat above Middle C, above Steinway and Sons, and gazed fondly at Mrs. Honeybee's face while she gazed fondly back. "Oh, how glad I am to see you again," each of them thought. Mary thought the same thing, but she was referring to the chocolate candy. "Should I sing to her?" wondered Wolf. "Should I sing her my very own composition now?" But then something told him, "No, this is not the moment. I want her to hear it first when we're alone together. Mommy might interrupt, and anyway, she's making a lot of noise gobbling that chocolate. I'll wait for the right time." "Tomorrow," said Mrs. Honeybee, "we'll have some music, okay, Mouse? Just now I'm going to bed. I'm a bit tired." However, that night she could not get to sleep. It was so odd to be in bed in the living room beside the grand piano. But then maybe by chance, or maybe because he sensed that this was what a cradle song was designed to do, Wolf began to sing, very softly, the Chopin lullaby. In a matter of minutes, Mrs. Honeybee fell asleep. In the days that followed, Wolf sometimes accompanied and sometimes not, sang all the songs that he'd learned, including the new one, for the weather was still fine and Mrs. Honeybee had at last taught him, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." But very often at night, when she was fast asleep in the living room, Wolf ran upstairs to practice and perfect his own composition in her bedroom. Meanwhile, Mrs. Honeybee progressed from crutches to canes, and from 2 canes to 1, and then she went back to the hospital to have her cast removed and to be told that her ankle had healed beautifully. She came home walking without a cane at all, and that night she climbed the stairs to sleep in her own room. She had said good night to the mice and had given them 1 chocolate each. She didn't have the heart to go back to the old ration of 1 between the 2 of them. And Mary didn't mind. She ate hers and what Wolf couldn't manage. Mrs. Honeybee lay in bed remembering her fall and how painful it had been and how the nice policeman had come climbing through the window. It was open now, the curtains drawn back so that the street light outside filled the room with a soft glow. "How did the man know I was in trouble?" she said. "I can't really recall what happened, but I thought my mouse was singing. No, I must have imagined all that." And then she heard a little rustling noise, which was Wolf scrambling up the curtains. And there he was, her singing mouse, sitting on the windowsill facing her. He stood up on his hind legs for a moment and dropped his head slightly, almost as though he were bowing to her, she thought, and then he began to sing his Swallow Sonata. Mrs. Honeybee lay spellbound. "I never taught him this," she thought. "I've never heard this piece of music before. Never in all my concert playing days did I hear this, and yet it must be one of the great classical composers. How light it is, how airy, how cheerfully joyful. But how come my mouse knows it? All he has learned from me. There can be only one explanation. He has composed it. It's his very own opus." Then, with a final reprise of his principal swooping, twisting, darting bird theme, the song ended, and Wolf sat silent on the sill. "Oh, Mouse!" cried Mrs. Honeybee, clapping her hands. "What a piece of work is this! You must teach it to me, Mouse. Tomorrow you must sing it through to me again and again, and I will somehow force my rheumatically old fingers to play all those lovely lilting notes." Why, Mozart could not have composed anything more entrancing, which gives me a sudden idea, a brilliant idea if I say so to myself, for a name to call you, instead of always saying Mouse. Mozart, you see, was not the greatest of musicians. He was not only the greatest of musicians, he was also the most precocious. He began to compose at a very early age, just like you. So why don't I call you by his name? Wolf listened to the lady without being able to understand a word that she said. She was pleased, though, and he felt sure of it. She approved of his swallow sonata, and he felt glad and proud. He saw her get out of bed and approach the window and stretch out an arm toward him very slowly. Then with one finger, Mrs. Honeybee very gently stroked him on top of his sleek brown head. Mozart's name, she said, was Wolfgang Amadeus, so that is what I am going to call you from now on. No, wait a bit, that's too much of a mouthful, I think. Why don't I just call you Wolf? She smiled happily to herself. You really are a ridiculous old woman, Jane Honeybee, she said. Here's a picture. It's Mrs. Honeybee petting Wolf. Isn't it so cool, you guys, that she ended up naming him not only the same name his mother gave him, Wolfgang Amadeus, but also she decided to just call him Wolf, and that's actually his name? Here's the very last sentence. Who but you would think of something so unlikely as a mouse called Wolf? The end. We did it. I hope that you liked that story. I love this one. Okay, bye guys.